Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to kind of peel back the layers on something that I think we all come up against, at least from time to time, and that's the idea of seemingly perfect lives. You know, those people we run into sometimes, they seem to just have it all together. So,
Mm.
so we're diving into a Reddit thread today that asks a really kind of simple question, but I think it's a really thought-provoking one. And the question is, did you have a friend growing up, right,
Right.
whose life just seemed totally ideal,
Yeah.
only to find out like years later
Yeah.
that it was actually the complete opposite?
Yeah.
So you've had some time to dig through this thread.
Yeah. What I thought was really interesting about it is just how many people responded to it. It
Yeah,
seems like this is something that we've probably all encountered at some point. The difference between that kind of curated image that people project
right.
versus like what's actually happening in their lives.
Totally, yeah. Like that whole idea of comparison is the thief of joy.
Oh, yeah.
This thread takes it even a step further. I think there's a lot of sort of cautionary tales in here about envy,
Mm-hmm.
right, and the importance of empathy. So what were some of the patterns that you noticed in the responses?
Well, one of the things that came up over and over again was childhood trauma.
Oh, yeah.
And how it can have these really lasting impacts. There are all these stories about people who seem to have these charmed lives, but then, later on you find out that they're struggling with stuff that stems all the way back to, difficult experiences they had when they were kids.
There's one comment that was particularly poignant, and it tells the story of this golden girl, this woman who was just like, excelled at everything,
Right.
but then after high school kind of disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
And years later, a former classmate ran into her working as a sex worker?
Yeah, that was a really heartbreaking one. And it led to a lot of discussion about, the potential for, some sort of abuse.
Yeah.
Some people were speculating that maybe something happened, with a teacher or something during middle school.
Hmm.
And, this speaks to just how insidious abuse can be, especially when it's coming from a place of authority.
Yeah, it's a chilling reminder that we never really know what's happening behind closed doors. And sometimes the people who seem to have it the most together are the ones who are actually carrying the heaviest burdens.
Absolutely. And there was actually another really powerful comment from somebody who was that seemingly perfect friend.
Oh, wow.
They talked about kind of having this picture perfect facade, like, comfortable home, successful in school and sports.
Uh-huh.
But behind it all, they were dealing with an abusive father and a mother who was battling addiction and mental health issues,
Wow.
and just the crushing loneliness of carrying that secret.
It's a stark reminder that outward appearances can be so deceiving. And I thought, you know what they said about feeling invisible?
Right.
Wondering why no one saw their pain was especially haunting.
Well, and it speaks to that pressure to maintain a facade, right?
Yeah.
Especially within families. This person mentioned that their dad was really obsessed with appearances,
Mhm.
always made sure to be, on his best behavior in public.
Right.
And that type of environment can make it so hard for a kid to feel safe enough to ask for help
Right.
or even acknowledge, their own suffering.
It's heartbreaking. And I this thread's making me think twice about some of the assumptions that I make about the people around me.
Well, and that's healthy, I think, to kind of re-examine those.
Right.
This theme, actually, of hidden turmoil behind a seemingly perfect life. This is something that's explored really beautifully in a poem
Okay.
that another commenter mentioned
Yeah.
called Richard Cory
Oh, yeah.
by Edward Arlington Robinson.
Mm-hmm.
It describes this, wealthy, admired man who appears to have it all
Right.
and then ends up taking his own life.
Oh, yeah. I remember those lines. He was a gentleman from Seoul to crown clean favored and imperially slim.
Right.
And then that gut-wrenching ending. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head.
It's a stark reminder that material wealth and appearances don't necessarily equal, happiness or inner peace.
Right.
And I think that's a theme that really runs through this whole Reddit thread.
It also makes you think about comparing ourselves to others.
Right.
We're so often just seeing the highlight reel and not what's happening behind the scenes.
Right. And that comparison can lead to envy
Yeah.
and, just feelings of inadequacy, which can be really damaging.
So we've seen kind of the dark side of these seemingly perfect lives,
Mm-hmm.
the hidden trauma, the pressure to keep up a facade. But there were also some really interesting observations about family dynamics
Yeah,
and how they can shape our perceptions.
absolutely.
So one commenter talked about a friend whose family just seemed very loving on the surface,
Right.
very peaceful, but as they got older, they realized that this kind of seemingly idyllic upbringing
Yeah.
hadn't really prepared them for challenges in real life.
Mm.
They lacked resilience, coping mechanisms.
Interesting point.
It's almost like this idea that a perfect childhood doesn't necessarily guarantee a smooth adulthood.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then there was another really thought-provoking comment about, the anxieties that people have about being parents.
Oh, yeah.
Some people were expressing this concern about their kids becoming a burden later in life,
Yeah,
which I think speaks to this kind of broader societal fear of dependence
right.
and, wanting to be self-sufficient,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, totally.
So
It's interesting.
it is. It really highlights that, families are complicated. And, speaking of complicated, there are some really shocking story in this thread about kind of the extreme consequences that hidden trauma can have.
Yeah.
One user shared this story about a girl who actually ended up shooting her abusive father.
Wow.
It's just a tragic example of what can happen when abuse is concealed.
Right.
And there aren't support systems in place.
It really underscores how important it is to recognize warning signs
Yeah.
and intervene early.
Yeah, absolutely. And it raises these questions too about, how trauma can be cyclical,
Right.
how it can impact generations. Another interesting thread that emerges from these stories is this idea that a lot of high achievers
Yeah.
are driven by this desire to overcome adversity,
Okay.
not because they actually, come from these perfect backgrounds.
So it's almost like their drive comes from, a need to prove themselves or to create a life that's different from the one that they experienced.
Yeah, like they're trying to outrun their past in a way.
Right, exactly. So their achievements might actually stem from insecurity
Right.
or a need for validation as opposed to, genuine passion.
Right. It challenges our assumptions about what success really means.
Totally. It reminds me of this one comment that really stuck with me. Somebody was talking about how they used to envy a friend who always had new toys.
Okay.
But then they realized later on that those toys were actually a symptom of neglect.
Oh, wow.
That the parents were kind of showering the kid with all this stuff
Yeah.
to make up for, not being emotionally present.
Right. Classic example of, mistaking material wealth for happiness.
Yeah, this whole thread is full of cautionary tales about envying other people
Right.
and making assumptions based on what we see on the surface.
Absolutely.
Like, you can't judge a book by its cover.
Nope.
One commenter talked about this friend whose family just seemed perfect.
Uh-huh.
Loving, supportive, financially secure.
Yeah.
But it turned out that their seemingly, solid foundation was actually built on all this infidelity
Wow.
and secrets.
Yeah, and that completely shattered, the image that they had of this family.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder how many other families, are hiding similar secrets.
Right. There's this other anecdote about a child who envied a friend because they seemingly had this never-ending supply of new toys.
Uh-huh.
But the child was completely oblivious to the fact that, the toys were actually a sign of neglect,
Right.
which is really sad to think about.
It is. And it, I think speaks to, we need to teach kids, to look beyond the surface
Yeah.
and understand that, material possessions don't equal happiness or, a loving home.
Right.
And it speaks to the responsibility we have as adults to create safe and supportive environments for kids,
Mm-hmm.
where they're not being manipulated or neglected.
So we've talked about hidden trauma, family secrets, the dangers of envy. But there's also this other insightful observation that comes up about how, certain personality types,
Right.
particularly people who are very successful
Yeah.
in demanding fields, might have traits that make them difficult to work with
Yeah.
or be in relationships with.
Their achievements may come at a high cost
Yeah.
to themselves
Mm-hmm.
and to the people around them.
Right. And so it reminds us that success is really complicated.
Yeah.
It's not always about, emotional intelligence
Yeah.
or healthy relationships.
Right.
One of the most compelling things about this whole thread is how it exposes these contradictions in human nature.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We see these examples of people who are both, incredibly resilient,
Yeah.
but also deeply flawed.
Right.
Capable of great love, but also immense cruelty.
It's a good reminder that we're all complex.
Yeah,
We're navigating a complicated world,
right.
and the way we see other people is often shaped by our own experiences and our own biases.
Totally. This thread is like a masterclass in empathy.
It is, yeah.
It's really making me, question some of my judgments about people.
I think it encourages us to move beyond those superficial assessments
Yeah.
and, consider, the struggles that other people might be facing.
And to appreciate the courage that it takes for people to share their stories, especially when those stories reveal, vulnerabilities
Right.
and imperfections.
Yeah, sharing those stories can be really cathartic.
Yeah.
And it can help break down the stigma around mental health and abuse and other challenges.
Right. It reminds us that we're not alone.
Yeah,
I think this thread has been a real eye-opener.
I agree.
So after all that, after this deep dive into these hidden lives, behind these perfect facades, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
I think, one of the most powerful lessons here is just the importance of empathy.
Yeah.
Really trying to reserve judgment
Right.
because we can never really fully grasp what someone else is going through,
Right.
no matter how idyllic their life might seem on the surface.
So it's a call to, lead with kindness and understanding, right?
Yeah,
Realizing that everyone is carrying their own burdens,
absolutely.
even those who seem to have it all together.
And, maybe instead of, falling into that trap of comparison and envy,
Right.
we can try to focus more on gratitude
Mm-hmm.
and connection.
Yeah.
Appreciate the good things in our own lives
Right.
and try to build relationships that are based on, authenticity rather than appearances.
That's such a valuable reminder. And I think this thread has really made me think about, my own assumptions and just try to have a more compassionate outlook.
It's a journey.
Yeah.
We can all kind of be on that journey together.
For sure.
And as we learn to see beyond the surface,
Yeah.
I think we open ourselves up to, deeper connections
Yeah.
and just a richer understanding of what it means to be human.
Right. And it reminds us that those vulnerabilities, those imperfections, are actually part of what makes us human. Right? And by sharing our stories and listening to the stories of others,
Yeah.
we can break down those walls of isolation
Yeah.
and create space for, genuine connection.
Absolutely. So I think, a final thought for our listeners to kind of ponder
Yeah.
is how has this deep dive kind of shifted your perspective on the people around you? What assumptions are you maybe questioning now?
Yeah.
And how can you bring more empathy and understanding into your own interactions?
It's a powerful question to think about. And, we never really know the full story
Nope.
behind someone's smile or their successes. But, if we approach each other with compassion and a willingness to listen, I think we can create a world where it's safer to be authentic and vulnerable
Absolutely.
and, fully human.
That's a beautiful thought to end on.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.